Have you ever been stalked by your deepest fears? Lisa has. Listen as she navigates the labyrinth of a haunted cemetery, her heartbeat deafening in her ears, chased by a terror she can't see, can't understand. Would you dare to walk in her shoes? Now, as we prepare to dive into our story, make sure you're comfortable. Are you ready? It's story time. The deafening thump of music still reverberated in Lisa's ears as she exited the high-rise apartment building, the epicenter of tonight's vibrant party scene. She bid goodbye to her friends, their cheerful laughter ringing out in the chilly night air, drowning out the unease that was starting to crawl up her spine. A creeping sensation, like a spider weaving a web of apprehension. She brushed it off, attributing it to the cocktail of drinks she'd consumed earlier. She descended the steps onto the cobblestone streets, the city's bright neon lights giving way to the dim, sputtering street lamps of the less-traveled side streets. Their flickering glow cast long, sinister shadows that danced menacingly on the brick walls. The familiar sights and sounds of the metropolis were replaced by an alien landscape of unfamiliar buildings and tight, winding alleys. Walking alone, she felt small, a lone figure swallowed by the vastness of the city. The laughter and music of the party seemed to fade into a distant memory, replaced by an eerie silence that was punctuated only by the echo of her footsteps. Each click-clack of her heels against the stone seemed unnaturally loud, slicing through the quietude like a knife. The bustling city streets she was used to were vibrant and full of life, but these forgotten alleys felt desolate and abandoned. The gnarled trees loomed overhead, their bare branches scratching the moonlit sky, their rustling leaves whispering secrets she didn't want to know. An uncomfortable chill swept over her, and she instinctively drew her jacket tighter around herself. It wasn't just the cold night air that made her shiver, but a sense of foreboding that was slowly seeping into her bones. It was as if the city was warning her, but against what? She did not know. As she ventured further into the unfamiliar labyrinth, the creeping unease was now a palpable fear that threatened to consume her. But with no other way home, Lisa had no choice but to continue on this unfamiliar path. Lisa's journey into the labyrinth of dimly lit back streets continued, her senses heightened by the uncomfortable stillness around her. The echo of her own footsteps was a constant reminder of her isolation, a solitary rhythm in the otherwise hushed cityscape. Suddenly, she noticed a subtle change in the echo, a fraction of a beat off, a tad heavier. It wasn't the echoing click-clack of her heels anymore, but a distinct set of footsteps that didn't belong to her. Her heart pounded against her ribcage as she stopped abruptly, the foreign echo persisting for a couple of beats before fading into silence. Her pulse roared in her ears as she swiveled around, squinting into the inky blackness behind her. Nothing but empty street. Yet, an unsettling feeling knotted in her stomach. She was not alone. Taking a deep breath, Lisa resumed her pace, her mind rationalizing the footsteps as a trick of her paranoia. But with every stride, she could hear it, a shadowy rhythm playing hide-and-seek with her own. The sensation of being pursued was no longer just a hunch. Someone was following her. Fear wrapped its icy fingers around her heart, causing her to quicken her steps, her heels clattering against the cobblestones in a panicked staccato. She could feel her pursuer mirroring her pace, maintaining a calculated distance, an unseen presence clinging to her like a sinister shadow. In a moment of desperation, Lisa veered sharply into a narrower passage, her breath hitching as she prayed to lose her pursuer. She took one last glance over her shoulder, catching sight of a fleeting shadow at the alley entrance before plunging deeper into the labyrinth. Little did she know, her chosen escape route was about to lead her into a far greater nightmare. Lisa continued her desperate flight, her body propelled by a primal fear that ignored the strain in her lungs and the sharp pain in her side. Each quick, shallow breath tasted like cold iron, yet the fear gripping her heart drove her on. But as she rounded another blind corner, she skidded to a sudden stop. In front of her loomed the old city cemetery, its ancient iron gates a cruel barricade in her path. A cold shiver of dread slithered down her spine. The city had given way to a forgotten realm of the dead, the monolithic tombstones standing like silent sentinels in the moonlight. Her desperate mind grappled with her new surroundings. This was not just a dead end. It was a realm removed from the life and energy of the city, a place forgotten by time itself. The air was colder here, stiller, as if even the wind dared not disturb the peace of the resting souls. She turned around, intending to retrace her steps, but the alley she'd arrived through was a menacing void of darkness. The thought of going back, of possibly running into her pursuer, sent waves of fear crashing over her. She was trapped. But she couldn't stand idle. With a shaky breath, she pushed the creaking cemetery gate open, stepping onto a path paved with centuries-old cobblestones. Moonlight washed over the gravestones, casting long, macabre shadows that danced with her every move. She moved deeper into the graveyard, her footsteps muffled by the layer of dew-kissed grass. The eerie silence was only disturbed by the distant hoot of an owl, its call reverberating between the stone crypts. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears, a solitary drum of dread marking her passage into the labyrinth of the dead. Her eyes darted between the graves, desperate for a sign of an exit, a way out of the terrifying predicament she'd stumbled into. Every rustle of wind, every shift of shadow sent fresh waves of fear coursing through her. Little did she know, her nightmare was only beginning. A strange flicker of orange light in her peripheral vision caused Lisa to pause. It wasn't the eerie silver glow of the moonlight or the cold, distant glimmer of city lights. It was warm, almost inviting. Against her better judgment, she moved towards it. As she neared, she made out the figure of a man, hunched and ancient like the cemetery itself. The glow came from the cigarette perched precariously between his gnarled fingers. The sight of another human brought both a flicker of hope and a new surge of fear. Who was he? Could he help her? As if sensing her presence, the man turned, his gaze as cold and lifeless as the gravestones around them. The embers of his cigarette glowed brighter as he inhaled, the plume of smoke rising like a spectral apparition in the chilly air. "You're late," he rasped, his voice sounding like gravel under a boot. Lisa froze, the man's casual greeting sending shivers of dread down her spine. His eyes gleamed with a predatory delight. "The game is simple," he continued, a sick smile spreading across his face. Her heart pounded in her chest as the man outlined the rules of his twisted game, her pleas for him to let her leave falling on deaf ears. The dread she felt multiplied with every word until she felt she might shatter from the strain. As the final rule fell from his lips, the man flicked away his cigarette, the dying embers mirroring the fading hope in Lisa's heart. Without another word, he gestured towards the depths of the cemetery, signaling the start of the hunt. Numb with terror, Lisa could do nothing but run. She bolted into the labyrinth of tombstones, the sounds of her own panicked breaths echoing in her ears. As she delved deeper into the graveyard, her world narrowed down to her pounding heart and the relentless pursuit of the nightmare that had chosen her as its prey. Lisa's frantic run through the labyrinth of gravestones was a nightmare come to life. Every shadow seemed to elongate into ghastly arms. Every rustle of the wind sounded like whispers of the dead. But the real horror came from behind her. The soft, crunching footfalls of the keeper, the occasional flicker of his cigarette, his chilling laughter bounced around the tombs, always seeming too close for comfort. The cemetery, once a peaceful place, had transformed into a terrifying maze, its narrow paths and sharp turns a cruel game in itself. The chilling silence was broken only by the sound of her own panicked breathing and the relentless pursuit of her predator. She could almost feel his eyes on her, tracking her, studying her like a cat with a mouse. Every rustle of leaves, every whisper of the wind sent adrenaline coursing through her veins. There were moments when she could hear him too close for comfort, his laughter dancing on the edge of her nerves. A number of times she found herself almost running into his outstretched arms, barely managing to dart away in the nick of time. And yet, she kept running, the terror in her heart outpacing the exhaustion in her limbs. Every step was fueled by pure fear, every gasp for breath a desperate plea for survival. The stakes had never been higher, and despite the growing pain in her side and the sting of cold air in her lungs, Lisa ran. She had no other choice. The macabre chase had just begun. Stumbling in the near darkness, Lisa misjudged a step, her foot catching on the edge of a hidden gravestone. With a gasp, she tumbled to the ground, her fall softened only by the damp grass. The dull thud of her body hitting the earth was followed by a sharp, agonizing pain that shot through her leg. She bit back a scream, her hands instinctively reaching for her injured limb. Looking down, she saw the twisted angle of her ankle, the dark silhouette of a stone sticking cruelly into her flesh. The sight of her own blood, dark and glistening in the dim light, sent a shiver of dread through her. She was not only trapped, but injured and vulnerable too. With trembling hands, she managed to free her leg from the stone, wincing at the fresh wave of pain that came with the movement. Her hands, now stained with her own blood, fumbled as she ripped a piece of her already tattered clothing. She hastily wrapped it around her wound, the fabric quickly soaking up the blood. The injury had significantly slowed her down, each attempt to stand resulting in a flare of pain that made her vision swim. Her safe distance from the keeper was closing rapidly. Her breathing came in ragged gasps, punctuated by whimpers of pain. She felt the cold creep of despair as she realized her situation. But she couldn't afford to break down, not yet. Not while her pursuer was closing in. And so, gritting her teeth against the pain, she forced herself to move. She had a twisted game to survive. As Lisa limped through the cemetery, she stumbled upon something that made her already racing heart come to a standstill. It was a small, cluttered area, hidden away behind a derelict crypt. But it wasn't the unkempt state of the area that caught her attention. It was what lay within it. Bones, human bones. Their white starkness almost glowing in the moonlight, they lay scattered across the ground. Skulls with vacant eye sockets seemed to stare at her, and the sight of smaller, delicate bones sent a wave of nauseating dread through her. Her first instinct was to scream, to run away, but her wounded leg and the realization of what this meant glued her to the spot. These were the remains of previous victims, people like her, who'd been trapped in this gruesome game and lost. The reality of her situation came crashing down on her, harder than ever before. A perverse part of her wanted to sift through the remains, find some sort of clue, some sort of help, but the thought of touching the cold, lifeless bones made her recoil. The horrific sight triggered a new wave of determination. She would not end up like them, she decided, her resolve hardening despite her trembling body. The silent victims of the graveyard seemed to watch as she moved away, dragging her injured leg and her renewed determination with her. The sight of the remains was a gruesome reminder of the stakes, making her already desperate situation even more chilling. But she couldn't afford to dwell on it. She had to move, had to survive. Her tormentor was still out there, lurking in the shadows. The maze of tombstones stretched before Lisa in a labyrinthine sprawl, a twisted design masterfully created for this sadistic game. Each path seemed to curve and twist upon itself, leading her deeper into the heart of the cemetery. The once familiar place, now devoid of peace, offered only dead ends and dread. Her senses became attuned to every movement, every sound, while the shadows seemed to grow and consume the light. The paths narrowed, hemming her in on all sides. Crypts loomed over her, their stone facades cold and impassive. They were ancient, covered in creeping vines and draped in shadows, making them seem alive with sinister intent. Each step was a struggle, her injured leg a burning reminder of her vulnerability. The once distant echoes of her pursuer were getting stronger, their steady rhythm a haunting serenade to her plight. Despite the agony in her leg and the terror clouding her mind, Lisa forced herself to keep moving. This was a test of endurance, a battle of wills, and she wasn't about to give up. She stumbled, staggered, and crawled, each movement driven by the instinct to survive. The pain became a distant echo as her mind focused on one thing only: escape. Her strength was fading, her vision blurring from exhaustion and fear. And then she saw it. A freshly dug grave. Its gaping darkness loomed before her, seeming to echo her own despair. Collapsing at its edge, she could feel her consciousness slipping away. As her world started to darken, she had one final thought. Was this her end? Or just another part of the gruesome game? Her limbs failed her at the edge of the gaping hole, and she fell. The world spun around her as she tumbled into the freshly dug grave, her descent ending with a thud that forced the air out of her lungs. Her injured leg screamed in protest, but the pain was quickly swallowed by the overwhelming terror of her predicament. She lay there, at the bottom of a grave, her breaths coming out in ragged gasps, her heart pounding a wild rhythm in her chest. The darkness was stifling, pressing down on her from all sides. The once comforting glow of the moon was now just a faint disk of light far above her, the rest of the world lost behind a veil of inky blackness. She could hear the distant hoot of an owl, the soft rustling of leaves in the wind, sounds of a night that seemed indifferent to her plight. Her mind swirled with panic, her thoughts a jumble of fear and despair. But despite the terror, a part of her was relieved. For a moment, she was hidden, invisible to her pursuer. For a moment, the chase was over, but the respite was fleeting as reality started to sink in. She was trapped in a grave, alone, injured, and with no way out. She could not see the cemetery keeper, but his presence hung in the air, a spectral menace in her darkest hour. Her hands reached out, fingers brushing the rough, cold earth of the grave's walls. She felt her strength wane, her eyelids droop. But sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had to stay awake, had to keep fighting. For now, her world had shrunk to this grave, her universe a pit of despair and earth. The endgame had begun. Her fingers clawed at the earthen walls, desperate to find purchase in the soft, loose soil. But every grasp, every frantic attempt to climb, only resulted in a shower of dirt cascading onto her. The more she struggled, the more the grave seemed to close in on her. Her leg throbbed, each pulse of pain a grim reminder of her dire situation. Panic clawed at the edges of her sanity, yet she fought to keep it at bay, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. Lisa began to dig, her nails ripping and bleeding as she carved out small handholds. She heaved herself up, her muscles screaming in protest, her breaths coming out in ragged gasps. But no matter how much she tried, her progress was painfully slow. The grave was too deep, the soil too loose. Every gain she made was soon lost as the earth crumbled beneath her. But Lisa didn't stop. She couldn't. Fear lent her a frantic strength, even as her body ached and her nails were torn to shreds. The grave was her enemy now, and she would not let it defeat her. Hours seemed to pass, each minute marked by the throbbing pain in her leg and the relentless fight against the imprisoning earth. Exhaustion started to set in, dragging at her limbs, clouding her mind. She was stuck in a nightmare, the grave a monstrous beast intent on swallowing her whole. The silence around her was heavy, interrupted only by the sound of her labored breathing and the soft rustling of dirt as she continued her futile attempts to escape. As her strength waned, despair started to creep in, wrapping its icy fingers around her heart. She sagged against the grave's wall, her mind teetering on the brink of surrender. But as the darkness threatened to consume her, something within her refused to give up. She wouldn't let this be her end, not like this. Her frantic struggle was interrupted by the sound of footsteps above. A sickening thrill of terror raced down her spine as the reality of her situation came crashing back. The cemetery keeper had found her. His silhouette, backlit by the cold moonlight, loomed ominously over the edge of the grave, blocking out the feeble light that had been her only source of comfort. Well, well. His voice was a coarse whisper, carrying a chilling note of satisfaction. It echoed down into the grave, bouncing off the earthen walls, amplifying the dread that filled her. You've certainly been busy, haven't you? His eyes, illuminated by the glow of his cigarette, bore into her. There was an eerie satisfaction in his gaze, a perverse joy that sent a shiver of revulsion coursing through her. She was the mouse in his game, a source of amusement to his sadistic whim. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small silver coin. "The rules of the game, love," he said, flipping the coin into the grave. It landed near her, glinting in the moonlight. "Heads, you live. Tails, well, you get the picture." His laughter was a low, rumbling sound that seemed to emanate from the very bowels of the earth, adding to the grotesque spectacle. His words, meant to unnerve her, hung heavy in the chilling air. His game, she realized, was not just physical torment, but psychological as well. And in the pit, at his mercy, her options were frighteningly limited. For a moment, she considered the coin, a symbol of her fate. The despair that had threatened to consume her flared up, the coin's sinister glint a cruel reminder of the hopelessness of her situation. Her mind spun, her thoughts spiraling into an abyss of terror. She was at the mercy of a madman, a pawn in his sick game. But even in the face of such horror, her will to survive surged, an indomitable force against the bleakness of her reality. She wouldn't let him win, not without a fight. His words hung in the air, echoing in the deathly silence of the night. Lisa looked at the coin, glinting mockingly in the faint light. Her body was a mess of pain and exhaustion, but her spirit remained unbroken. She was not going to let him decide her fate. Not this way. But even as this defiant thought flared within her, the echo of a shovel striking earth reverberated through the silence. The sound was a grim herald of the inevitable. He was going to bury her alive. The cruel reality of her situation was all too stark, yet she refused to let it consume her. "Wait!" she cried, her voice hoarse from fear and desperation. She locked eyes with the man above, her gaze hard and defiant. But he ignored her plea, his focus solely on the grim task at hand. The first shovelful of dirt fell into the pit, the particles dancing in the scant light before settling on her. Each successive load felt heavier, a harsh reminder of the terrifying fate that awaited her. Her screams, her pleas were swallowed by the grave, unheard and ignored by her tormentor above. With the last ounce of her strength, Lisa lunged for the coin, her fingers just barely brushing against the cold metal. But the effort was too much. Her vision blurred, her strength fading. The world spun, and she collapsed, her hand still outstretched towards the coin. Her breathing slowed, the harsh reality of her situation fading into an incomprehensible blur. As the world dimmed, the sound of earth hitting the wooden floor of her would-be tomb seemed to grow faint, as if receding into the distance. The last thing she remembered was the sight of the coin, now half buried in the soil. It glinted ominously in the dying light, a chilling reminder of the game she had lost. Or had she? As her consciousness slipped away, her mind still clung onto one last thought, one last shred of hope. The game wasn't over, not yet. And then everything went black. As our story comes to a close, let the lull of this soothing ambiance continue to cradle you further into your journey of calmness and rest. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of your relaxation and sleep routine tonight. Remember, each day brings a new story, and each night brings a fresh chance to regenerate, to dream, and to become more of who you are. As this background sound lulls you further into sleep, I hope you find peace, comfort, and a well-deserved rest. Good night, dear listener. Until our next story, sleep well and dream beautifully.